so much for joining me, you guys. This is Kalsoom and Misbah, who are joining me from DC and from Karachi. And they are both co-founders and general partners of Eye-to-Eye Ventures, which is a VC based out of Pakistan, investing in the startup ecosystem. So welcome, you guys.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Priya.
Thank you. So I wanted to talk to the two of you because you're in such a unique position in this emerging market in Pakistan, where there's a lot of young companies that are up and coming, and there's a dearth of honestly women-led funds out there that are investing in female-led companies. Can you talk to me a little bit about what got you interested in that part of this ecosystem?
So Priya, I think for us at the fund, so much of our story really begins with our sibling entity, Invest To Innovate, which is a company that I founded 9 years ago, which really kind of led us to the fund, to be honest. I mean, we've been working in the startup ecosystem in Pakistan for 9 years now on the support side. So we launched the country's first startup accelerator program. We've been operating on the ground and in the market with entrepreneurs, with local angel investors. We've been doing research on the market for the last 5 years. And it was, for me personally, and because this is a thing about us also being women, what was really interesting was that, so many of the founders that have gone through our program are also women-led companies. We actually have had about 60% of our companies that graduated from our flagship program as women-led. So what was interesting was that I was constantly advising entrepreneurs on raising funding. I was talking to investors. I was constantly crowing about this injustice oftentimes that existed for founders in terms of bad terms that they would get from investors. And someone actually had to say to me that, why don't you think about investing yourself? And it was so interesting because I never had put myself in the arena that way, because I didn't have the traditional VC background in that sense, right? I didn't come from finance. I came from working with startups, and that was where I cut my teeth in the ecosystem and really was working from that lens. And it was really interesting because I coach women all the time, and yet I was also not putting myself in the arena. And then I also said, why not? As we're telling people what to do from an investment perspective and working with startups, we're actually the best place to do it. So that kind of speaks to the evolution of me personally, of deciding to move into launching a fund. And I think, Misbah knows really well about, I definitely had a lot of imposter syndrome in the beginning, because a lot of people, mostly men, basically told me that I didn't really have any business doing it. And then realizing really quickly as I was doing it, how much my background and the work that I'd been doing in it for a decade in the market actually made me really well placed to be an investor. And starting to own that power of that was something I think was one of the biggest lessons and learnings in my learning curve that I had with myself personally. And Misbah can share more about her experience, because she has a little bit of a traditional background, but also a really nonlinear path. So I'll let her give a little bit more on that too.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, thanks. So like Kalsoom said, my path has definitely not been linear at all. But I have been in finance in some way or the other for the last 22 years or more. So I did the traditional route, went to business school, did my MBA, went to a bank, started working with Citigroup. And it wasn't until it was like a few years in that I, sort of had an aha moment. And I was like, I really don't want my boss's job. I'm not excited about the opportunities that my peers are excited about. And I really took a step back. And at that time, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I knew what I didn't want. And I didn't want to be a banker. I didn't want to continue in that path. And so I moved into public affairs after a few years after that. I actually moved into impact investing with Acumen, which was starting out in Pakistan, which is a social venture fund. So that was already that first step out of that sort of traditional path of just going through the motions, helped me take a step back and say, okay, there's a whole world out there in terms of what all I want to do. And it's not that I can't do banking, but it's just that I might want something else for myself. Yeah. And so I worked in impact investing. It really gave me an opportunity to see Pakistan in a way that I would never have had the opportunity to do if I had stayed in traditional banking. I got to sit got to go into the field. I got to sit with women in microfinance lending groups and understand how they make decisions. I got to go into bastis, into people's homes, and really understand how people make decisions at the base of the pyramid. And it was a real learning for for me.
Now, as you were starting out, talk to me a little bit about, Kalsoom, you kind of dabbled in this a little bit, the prejudice or the bias that existed from your peers that are within this venture space. What was that experience like? Were there any mentors that encouraged you, or was it mostly just naysayers?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of like, why don't you stay in your lane? To what Kalsoom was saying earlier on in this conversation is like, oh, you guys have been, ecosystem builders, or Invest to Innovate has been an ecosystem builder. You've been working with the startups in all this time and mentoring them and helping them. Why don't you just keep doing that? And some of that is linked to this soft approach where they think like, okay, women can be nurturing and they can, help mentor. So why don't you just keep doing that? Why do you have to be like hardcore, sort of look into being investors, and that's one aspect of it. And then the other aspect of it is that we continuously get discounted and not taken as seriously, even though we may have a lot more experience in Pakistan than a lot of other people in the space do. And it's usually not our peers, like Kalsoom said. I think other funds and other investors in the space don't do it, but people around this space do. So people that are giving to the space, or possibly even founders that are looking for investments, they do have this sometimes unconscious bias and sometimes very, very visible stated bias as well. And I think that also is, discounts the fact that women actually, women founders and women-led companies actually are able to do much better for funds as potential investments than all male portfolios, for example. So that does happen quite a bit with us. I think it just puts more of a fire under us to do better. And Kalsoom and I keep sort of cheering each other up and just saying, we're just going to do the work and let the work speak for itself. And that's what we're doing.
Talk to me a little bit about kind of what it's like. So both of you have worked overseas. Misbah, you've worked in New York with companies out here, and then, Kals, you're based in DC. So you've kind of worked with what US-based companies are like and how they operate. What's it like working with companies in Pakistan? Are there any differences that you notice, specifically strengths or weaknesses that they have?
I think the work environment, broadly speaking, is very different. I think the general approach to work is very different. I think there's, this is not to sound like everybody else does, but really there is a problem in our education system in Pakistan, and people don't come out of that learning how to think critically. So that analytical approach, that critical thinking is often missing, and a lot of people learn it on the job. And those of us who've been lucky to have good mentors or good people around us in the workplace actually learn that in the workplace, and not often a skill that we come in with. So there's a difference in the work environment, broadly speaking. Then there's also what skills you're coming in with. And I think beyond that, there is, the two sides of it. One is that there's more of a regimented sort of approach where you feel like you have to sit on people's heads, or you have to really make sure people do things. And on the other hand, there's this concept of jugaad, which is like, you just figure out a way to fix it. And we're great at that. Right. So there's both sides of it where on one hand you can say, well, you're not really taking that professional approach, and that is holding us back in a lot of ways. But on the other hand, if you look at the ingenuity that people have and the kinds of things that they come up with, for good and for bad, the way our minds work is actually pretty ingenuous in terms of getting things done. So I think it's a bit of a balance, and I do think that people that have only had the exposure to working outside Pakistan, when they come into Pakistan, it's a really big change, and they have to really shift gears. And it can be frustrating at times because the work ethic is very different. But it's its own beast. And I think you have to work within the system and try to make the most of it wherever you can.
Totally. And I can speak from the perspective of having built a company in Pakistan as someone who is, I sound completely American, and I think I'm very American in my sensibility as well, right? Obviously, I'm now an American citizen, but I grew up in Pakistan. But my perspective and my sensibility that I came into building a company in Pakistan really was very American in my thinking, in terms of not very top down, much more of a flatter structure. And it was really interesting because I think the assumption is that if Pakistan, I think everyone comes in with the assumption that people are used to a certain environment. So let's continue to provide that environment rather than change things, right? And for me, I think I was always someone who was like, let's just be different, because I don't want to create an environment where people feel scared to talk, or if they don't feel empowered to be able to lead. And what I feel so proud of in the 9 years that I was the CEO of Invest to Innovate was that we've had so many people come through our doors at that company that came from really toxic work environments that are exactly what Misbah was saying, right? Of that top down, very like sir type of, it's totally a sob culture in terms of the way that we operate, right? But to like, for them to, when they came into our company, what I really loved was watching where they are now, and seeing where people have gone after Eye to Eye. So like, people have gone on to work at Google, like Mina Tariq is like a partner at Caravan as a fund. We have like, someone's the head of research and strategy at a microfinance bank, right? And knowing that we played a small part of that role of dismantling their previous notions of what workplaces could look like and challenge that just by virtue of saying like, it is audacious to be different, just by virtue of saying we don't have to go by the norms here, to me is something that is, without meaning to, we did that, right? And we continue to do that at that company. And that's actually how we operate as a fund as well. And I think also another thing that I'll just mention as like an observation of someone kind of being in the US and then being in Pakistan is, as you know so well, Priya, Pakistan is such a relational market, right? It's
100%.
deeply based on relationships. It's deeply based on like sitting down and having chai with someone and getting to know them over time and building trust, right? Because we don't have the infrastructure or the systems in place that actually uphold trust. So as a result, so much is based on these relationships. And so I will say that one of the best pieces of advice that I got when I was launching Eye to Eye, the sister entity 10 years ago, was from a friend who was the founder of 500 Startups, one of the partners at 500 that then helped launch 500 in other countries. And one thing that he said to me, he said, you shouldn't be hiring people that are good at building businesses. You should be hiring people that are good at building community. And that was one of the best pieces of advice, because Pakistan is like a community-based type of trust society, right? So for me, that became almost like a mantra in my head from a hiring perspective. Like, is this someone that, especially for when you work with startups, it really is about community building, right? So those are some of the observations, like outside in, sometimes from a fishbowl perspective, that I sometimes feel like I have, and then having to like kind of work within the system as someone who's somewhat seen as a foreigner in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you had experienced any bias based on sounding a little bit different, right? Like as I'm getting started in this space also, there's a couple of founders that have reached out for me to, come in and just advise them as they're growing their businesses. And one of the feedbacks that I've gotten is, well, she's very Western though. Like, does she understand
Really?
the market? And I'm like, born and raised there. I'm as Pakistani as they come. But I was wondering if you had been on the receiving end of bias based on that.
I'm sure there is people that, I mean, I know that the very first thing that people mention to me is how strong my American accent is, right? Like at least Priya, you kind of have a neutral approach on that, right? Right. And, but from my perspective, I think it is something that's it's something that people notice off the bat. I'm also, people make jokes about it because I am really chatty. So I have a very American sensibility about me in terms of super chatty. I'm a hugger, like all these things, very like, talk about vulnerability and all the things that we do on like the US. But I don't know. Misbah can probably comment on it more than me because she sees me from the outside perspective versus how I feel. I'm really good at people, I don't think anyone's ever commented that you're too Western, because I think I do. It's more because I understand the market so well. And I typically understand the market better than most people because I've been working there for 10 years, right? And so I kind of understand the ins and outs. I know how to kind of code switch in some ways to shift for the environment. But yeah, I don't know, Misbah, you're kind of more of a better placed person to comment on how I show up. But I tend to feel pretty comfortable for the most part. But Miss, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I think you highlighted all of the points that I would have said. So I think yes, the way you speak does come across first, but I think people often discount that, saying, oh, she's not from here. But I think very quickly in the conversation, they realize what depth Kalsoom actually has and how much she knows about the space. And of course, having grown up in Pakistan, so there's things that she can relate to. So it's not as if she's a transplant, even though she may sound American or be American in a lot of sort of mannerisms or outlook. So I think, and people are actually, I mean, I love it. I love sometimes seeing the transformation where they're like, when the more they talk to Kalsoom, the more they realize how much she actually knows. And it's kind of like, you can see the respect building. And again, I think part of it is just being women sometimes that just doesn't start off at that point. On that sort of that level of saying, here's someone that is an expert in what they're doing, but it's definitely something that grows with time, and especially with somebody that's talking to Kalsoom, it's something that they can get a handle on pretty quickly, because she's not, I mean, she's very knowledgeable about the space, and of course, culturally very much in Pakistani as well. And it's interesting that you asked that, because for me, when I moved to the US, it was very late in my, I was in my mid 30s, early 30s. I was definitely, moved in a career context, and I'd lived in Pakistan my whole life, except for a few years when I was in high school with my parents, and we lived in Paris. But when I moved to the US, people said, oh, so, did you go to college here? And I said, no. And they're like, well, you must have worked here before. And I said, no. And they're like, but how come you're so American? And I never thought of myself as American. I'm not, but yet for them, the traditional Pakistani, woman, or I'm sure they saw me as an outlier, but for them, the traditional Pakistani would look differently, talk differently, dress differently, do different things. And so it's, sometimes we're breaking molds without even realizing it. And it wasn't until I used to get all these barrage of questions being like, but really, are you sure you didn't ever work in, live in the US? And where did you learn your English? And so things like that, where, there are cultural expectations that we have, which, don't necessarily always hold true when you come down to actually looking at things.
Yeah, that's I love that you talked about that a little bit, because that's one of the motivators behind me speaking to women specifically from the Pakistani ecosystem, is kind of highlighting those voices here. My network professionally is mostly based here in the US. Where do you see the Pakistani market going? And do you think that there's going to be an increase in the amount of female founders that you're seeing based on, there being a female-led fund and more voices like yours kind of lending their voice to this space?
Should I go first, Miss?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think there's a few things. Oh my gosh, I could write a book about this actually, because we work on it so heavily on our sibling entity. So we were tasked a year ago in 2019, actually, so 2 years ago, I guess technically a year and a half, by the World Bank, specifically the Women's Entrepreneurial Finance Initiative, to specifically look at the ecosystem and take a gender lens approach in collecting data about that, right? So what we discovered was that two things. Number one is that out of all the deals that have happened in the market so far, only 3% could be attributed towards female-founded or co-founded companies, right? Which is a reflection of what we see globally. So to note that statistically, that's very similar to the US. So it's not abnormal for Pakistan to be like that, but obviously that's not great. At the same time, when we surveyed investors, we saw, and obviously we were included within that survey, is that 75% of investors said that they did not see a difference between in the quality of companies led by women or mixed gender teams or ones led by men, but they just didn't see enough companies led by women. And so I think that speaks to a few things. Number one, and this actually speaks to a lot of the work that our sibling entity does, which is how do you increase the funnel of like women-led companies, but also, and this is something that Misbah and I talk about a lot, right, is that not every company that raises money or not every company that needs to raise money is a venture deal, right? And that's okay. And actually, if anything, we need to create a way to be more encompassing of all the variations of like, cash flow based financing or revenue based financing or venture debt. There's a few people like Faisal at Zane Capital that's doing some really cool instruments right now. And so I think what we often do, and we do this in the US as well, is we place a lot of value to what venture deals look like. We place a lot of value to exits and unicorns and things like that. And the reality is that not every company, and also a lot of women-led companies that we look at, are going to raise VC money, and that's okay because there should be other options for them that are out there. I do see, and I think Misbah and I both see, We do see really good deals that are coming up that are led by women. But what's interesting right now, especially in the post-COVID or current COVID world, since we're very much not post-COVID right now, is that a lot of the sectors that have really seen that leapfrog, most of the deals are led by all male teams, right? So in order for us as funds, and Misbah and I are very, very aware of this, as because we don't just invest in female-led companies, but we very much are activists about this. We have to actively look at that pipeline, right? It means that you can't passively, if we passively sat and waited back for the deals to come to us, we'd only invest in men, right? But we recognize that we need to actively go out and say, like, how can we actually find better deals that are maybe led by women? How can our sibling entity actually be very, very beneficial for that, right? How can we leverage that a little bit more? So I think, maybe Misbah, you want to speak more about the market as a whole, but from a female perspective, we're seeing it improve, but it's slow, right? Even in the last year, the number didn't really improve. I think companies raised close to about $60 million in capital. Female-led companies, mixed gender and female founded, only raised 3 million of that amount, right? So when we hear the number, it's like crap. But then the other part of the number is that for the first time, we saw the largest deals happen by female-led companies, right? So AimFit raised $1 million. We saw CoNatural and Big Gallery both raise around 800,000, which are very large deals, right? So I think it's important to say that because most female-led companies were mostly just raising pre-seed and seed, and we're kind of dying off and raising much smaller average amounts. So there's the negative, of course, and then there's also the way to look at it from a qualitative perspective of saying, like, what is going well and how can we also capitalize on that too. But yeah, let's go ahead. I could write a book.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add there to what Kalsoom said is that the market generally is growing. And in the last 2 years, we've seen a big uptake in terms of the number of deals done, the kinds of deals that are done, later stage, higher amounts, more investors interested in the space, and also the quality of founders and the founders with experience and relevant experience also increase. And so, the women aspect is a subsection of that. But just as the market itself is growing, we're confident and really excited about how the women segment of that is also going to grow. But I think it's also important to say, so the examples that Kalsoom gave around the deals, they're, as a percentage of the total portfolio, they're very small, but then that's also the case in a lot of other venture spaces in across the world as well. And I think what's exciting for us is that we're starting to see more and more women come into the space, and that are strong founders and that are setting up companies. We still are seeing more traditional businesses being started by women. So craft companies, home-based companies like food delivery and home cooked food, etc., or things that are focused on women only as customers, and which is fine. It's just that those kind of businesses sometimes have a different trajectory in terms of how they grow. And so to Kalsoom's point earlier, I think we need to find a space as a market to provide support to all of those kinds of businesses. And I think we'll see many more women founders then grow their businesses and come into the point where they're raising more money, and not just money as an indicator, but the business itself growing. So I think it's a subset of the bigger market, which is still relatively very new in Pakistan, but that we're excited for it to be changing.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so very much for taking out the time for me today. I feel like I could sit here for hours and hours and talk to the both of you. But this has been wonderful, and I wish you the best of luck with the fund and the companies that you're investing in. I think the work you're doing is extremely important. So good luck with everything, and thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Absolutely.
Thanks.